Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, I wanted to try something a little bit different from what we would normally do. I wanted to try to cover a few different cases without having to go into such a deep dive on them. Now, that's not to say that I'll never do a deep dive on the cases that we talk about today, but this is something that I thought would be fun to try, so I figured, why the hell not? If we decide it's something that you like, then maybe we could do more of these down the road. If you hate it, feel free to shoot me an email or leave a comment. Just let me know. So with all that being said, without further ado, let's get it. So firstly, let's talk about a man named Stephen Clark. He was born on August 30th, 1969 to his parents Doris and Charles Clark in England. Stephen was permanently disabled after a truck hit him at the age of 3. It's reported that Stephen's mom, Doris, was leaving the house to go get some shopping done, and that she hadn't even really realized that Stephen had walked out of the house behind her. Because he was supposed to have been staying home while she was out, I'm using context clues here to assume that either Stephen's dad or maybe even another adult was going to be staying with Stephen while Doris was out shopping. So no one noticed that he had gone out of the door shortly after Doris had, and Doris didn't even know that Stephen had gone out of the house until after he was hit by a truck just seconds after she walked out of the house. Stephen wasn't really expected to make it through this accident, but after more than a month in the hospital and lots of dedication, Stephen did manage to beat all the odds, because not only was he not supposed to make it out of the hospital alive, it was also believed that Stephen would never walk, talk, or live any real kind of productive life. And Stephen beat all of those odds. He did learn to walk. Yes, he walked with a limp, but he walked. Stephen also did learn to talk, and he even went on to be a contributing member of society, later even working with people with disabilities, teaching them how to improve their employment skills. So the accident did cause severe damage to his left arm, resembling like a stroke victim. It also impacted his legs, and Stephen walked with a pretty prominent limp from here on out after this accident. But he did beat all of those odds, and he even later went on to win the Apprenticeship of the Year award, which he was incredibly proud of. Despite his disability, Stephen looked forward to working and being active in his community. He was close with both of his parents, and his older sister Victoria was his hero. Stephen was well-versed in computers and music, and was reportedly even a strong swimmer. His sister Victoria recalls how much she loved Stephen's sense of humor and how contagious his laughter was. So it seemed like Stephen did everything that doctors said that he would never do, and like he wanted to go on about his life just like every other person in their early 20s typically would. And that's exactly what he was doing. Stephen had met a girl at a local pub, and the two had been dating. The relationship was still pretty fresh, and the couple had gone on a few dates, but Stephen was excited to see where the relationship was headed, and he was excited for what his future held. But on December 28th, 1992, all of those plans, dreams, and goals would come to a screeching halt. So let's fast forward to December 28th. Stephen was 23 years old, and he and his mom had decided to go for a walk on the beach in Saltburn, England, where they lived. They had been hanging out for the day, just enjoying the weather, the water, and the sand. Stephen had originally planned to go watch a game with his dad, but he'd actually changed his mind when he learned that he would have to pay for his own ticket for the game in order to go. So he wasn't going for that. Because according to the people that knew Stephen the best, he hated spending his own money on things, which, fair, I hate it too. So Doris and Stephen had just been hanging out on the beach up until about 3 p.m. when they both agreed that nature was calling. They walked to the public restrooms, and they both went in to their, separate stalls. Stephen's mom, Doris, finished up, and she walked out of the ladies' room, and she just kind of waited around for a while, waiting on Stephen to come out of the men's room. Doris just assumed that she had finished before Stephen, so she waited. But after she'd waited around for so long, because she did say that she did wait for a while, but Stephen hadn't come out of the restroom yet. So Doris wondered if maybe Stephen had finished in the restroom before she had, and then went ahead and headed back home instead of waiting around for her to come out. Because from my understanding, this beach that they had been hanging out at this day was like a 45-minute walk from their house. So maybe Stephen had just been ready to get back home, and he'd headed home before his mom had gotten done and come out of the restroom. And I've seen on Reddit and other forums where people speculate as to why Doris didn't just pop her head into the men's restroom to see if Stephen was still in there. But Doris herself does say Stephen wasn't a small child, he was a 23-year-old man, so keep that in mind. Now, I'm sure that Doris wishes more than anything that she could go back and do anything differently about this day, but hindsight is 20/20 and we don't get do-overs in life. So when Doris got back home and she realized that Stephen wasn't there, that's when she kind of started to worry. She waited on her husband to get home from the game, and they went off to search for Stephen. They went back to the beach thinking that maybe he hadn't walked home, maybe he was still out just walking the beach by himself. But there was no sign of Stephen at the beach or at any of his other favorite hangout spots or spots that he was known to be at and frequent. And this is when Doris and Charles phoned police to report that their son was missing. And of course, once Stephen's sister Victoria was made aware that Stephen was missing, she immediately headed out to help search for her brother. And even though Doris and Charles had already searched along the beach for Stephen, police also had to do their own searches, just to make sure, do their due diligence. But the police searches didn't turn up anything either. And the only clues were that two people who did actually know Stephen reported that they'd seen him after the time that he was reported missing. So the fact that these two people did know Stephen makes these two sightings more credible than if it was just somebody who saw Stephen's face on a missing persons flyer and said that they'd seen him. So the first sighting was reported just 2 days after Stephen was reported missing on December 30th, 1992. And it was reported that Stephen was not too far from his house walking down the road towards town by himself, and it was approximately 2 p.m. This witness says that they didn't stop Stephen or speak to him, but that they did know that it was Stephen. But then later on, when police interviewed this witness, the claim changed a little bit. The witness says that the man that he saw walked similarly to the way that Stephen walked because Stephen did have a limp, which was distinct. And during the police interview, this witness said that he hadn't seen Stephen's face, so he couldn't be 100% sure if it was him, which is actually the complete opposite of what he had claimed to begin with. The next person who claimed that they saw Stephen was on January 14th, so just a little over 2 weeks after Stephen was missing. This witness claimed to have seen Stephen walking behind another man while she was looking out of the window at her house. She said that the way that she interpreted it was almost like Stephen was trying to walk at a faster pace in order to keep up with the man that was walking in front of Stephen. The witness says that this was about 5 p.m. on January 14th when she saw Stephen, and she also claimed that the other man that was walking in front of Stephen was a middle-aged man, maybe between his 50s and 60s, with gray hair and glasses. Now, I did say that both of these witnesses knew Stephen, which did make their claims a little more credible. Now, this lady who claimed to have seen Stephen on January 14th said that she'd seen on the news that Stephen was missing and that she knew it was him because one of her family members worked at the bowling club that Stephen and his family frequently visited. Now, this witness says that she was sure that it was Stephen that she's seen. But police were able to point out the fact that it would have been almost dark by 5 p.m. when she claimed to have seen Stephen, but not just that. The window that she says that she was looking out of when she saw Stephen, that window was actually super far. And it seems like maybe it would have been hard to know for sure if that was Stephen. And from here, it's almost like Stephen vanished into thin air. Because no one at the beach that day came forward to say that they saw anything, heard anything, nothing. There was also nobody from the men's room that came out that day to give police any more information. There were no more tips, no more eyewitnesses, no more sightings, just nothing. And Stephen's case just went completely cold for years and years and years. That wasn't until a local news station received an anonymous letter in regards to Stephen's disappearance. The letter was received on September 29th, 1999, but the contents of the letter were never made public. But one of the investigators that's working on Stephen's case did later come out to say that the letter made it seem as if Stephen was dead, and that whoever had written this letter claimed to have known who was responsible for Stephen's murder. And we don't know for sure who this letter implicated, but it's kind of speculated that the letter may have given the police a reason to look into Stephen's parents as suspects in his disappearance. Police didn't believe that Stephen was still alive for a few reasons, but for starters, Stephen never took his glasses or his wallet with him to the beach that day, and they were just left at his house. And secondly, Stephen had won a cash prize as a part of his apprenticeship award, and he had never collected that money. So it seems like police went straight from no leads and no suspects straight into arresting Stephen's parents. Because in September of 2020, which is a lot of years later, that's exactly what police did. They arrested Doris and Charles both on suspicion of murder. Interestingly enough, though, both Doris and Charles were former police officers, which I feel like that just kind of adds a little question mark to this case. But by the time that Doris and Charles were arrested in connection to Stephen's murder, they were in their 80s. And even after police pushed Doris about why she didn't check the men's bathroom for Stephen before she left and headed back home, they also asked Doris about how Charles was as far as his temper was concerned. Could he have snapped? Whatever. But even after this rapid-fire questioning that seemed to come out of nowhere, both Doris and Charles say that they didn't have anything to do with their son's death. And when police started focusing their attention on Doris and Charles, they went all the way in. They did multiple searches of the couple's house. They dug up their entire yard where their family lived. And these searches and searches and excavations, they absolutely nothing showed up. Nothing. And still, there's been nothing found. Police were actually able to figure out who had sent that letter into the news station all those years before. And essentially, the person who wrote the letter said that they didn't actually have any facts to back their claims up, but that they were more so going off their intuition instead of fact. So the author of the letter didn't actually know the Clark family in any way, shape, or form, and with police not being able to find even one single piece of evidence to tie to Doris or Charles to Stephen's murder, they had no choice but to let them go. You can't hold someone on suspicion of murder without anything to tie them to the actual murder. And as of right now, we don't even know if there was for sure a murder. And even though there was nothing to point to as far as Doris and Charles being involved in Stephen's murder, that doesn't exactly stop the public and the people in town from talking. This investigation essentially ruined the reputation that Doris and Charles had kept intact for their entire lives up to this point. And Stephen's sister Victoria said that when she learned that her parents had been arrested on suspicion of murder, that she absolutely refused to believe that her parents were involved in any way. She's never wavered on where she stands as far as her parents being involved. Doris and Charles both claim that for 28 years, they had been trying to get police involved in Stephen's disappearance. And then just out of the blue, the police show up in 2020 to arrest them on the same case that they'd been begging for the police's help with. There are some experts who think that maybe Stephen did walk home that day and that he could have possibly lost his balance and fallen over a cliff, but most people don't think that that's probable. And then, of course, there are always going to be the people who swear that a missing person just ran away to start a new life, but that doesn't track either. There have been no other suspects and no other leads in Stephen's case, and he's been missing for more than 30 years. There's not a clue, not a witness, not a theory in sight that makes sense for this case. Now, for this next case, we're heading to Mississippi, where Angela Schultz Shiers Barrentine was born to her parents Joey and Deborah Schultz. Yes, that's a lot of names. I felt that was important. Angela was born on February 5th, 1977, and she was born and raised in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Angela finished high school and attended community college. After Angela graduated, she gave birth to a daughter of her own who she named Ginger. Angela was known to love the outdoors. She liked to fish, she liked NASCAR, and she prided herself on being a good mom. But as much as she loved her daughter, we all have our vices, and Angela struggled with her addiction from the time that she was a teenager on. An addiction typically goes hand in hand with being around some pretty shady people with questionable backgrounds, but that doesn't take away from who Angela was as a person. She was trying to get her life back, she was trying to take control of what she wanted, and get life to, swing in her favor. At the time of her death, Angela was working 2 jobs, and she'd even met a man named Daniel. Daniel and Angela would go on to later get married, and it was only 3 weeks after their wedding that Angela would be reported missing. And I know what you're thinking, the husband did it, we have it on a t-shirt, but stick with me. Because it was on November 24th in 2004 when 27-year-old Angela was at home, she was cooking dinner, and her grandparents stopped by. Now, her grandparents were stopping by to make sure that Angela was still planning to come to their house the next day for Thanksgiving dinner. Angela assured them that she would be there. Her grandparents hung out for a little bit, and then they reportedly left Angela and Daniel's house at around 6:30 p.m. Now, after this, Angela got $10 from her husband Daniel, and she left their house in her new ride, which was a purple Ford F-150 truck. Angela was supposedly only going out to grab a pack of cigarettes, and I'm not sure why her husband wouldn't have reported her missing if she didn't come home shortly after she was supposed to have left to get the cigarettes. But from my understanding, it wasn't until the next day, which would have been November 25th, 2004, that Angela's grandparents reported her missing when she never showed up for Thanksgiving dinner. Now, they had just stopped by her house the night before to double, triple check with her to make sure that she would be at Thanksgiving dinner. And when she didn't show up, and when nobody was able to get in touch with Angela, her grandparents reported her missing. Now, there were a couple of Angela's friends who said that their whole friend group had met up at one of their houses that Thanksgiving morning at 8:30 a.m. So it's extremely possible that Angela did actually come home the night before when she'd run out to get cigarettes, especially if there were multiple friends saying that they saw Angela the next morning. Now, all of Angela's friends say that, she left and she was supposed to have been heading back home. Now, there was another one of Angela's friends who said that they saw Angela driving her truck around 12 o'clock on Thanksgiving Day. Now, it said that Angela was driving in the direction of her house when this friend saw her at 11:30 or 12, and that no one else was in the truck with Angela. And while Angela did struggle with her addiction, everybody agrees that she was a mother above all else, and that she would have never just abandoned her daughter Ginger. But Angela was never seen again after that friend saw her driving a truck in the direction of her house. 9-year-old Ginger was placed into the care of her aunt and Angela's sister Stacy, and for 8 months, there was nothing. No leads, no tips, no eyewitnesses, and no suspects. But then in August of 2005, the water levels were at an all-time low. Now, Angela's family had never stopped pushing for more searches and a deeper investigation, but when the water levels at, I think it's Big Black River, they were as low as 7.5 feet, I think. That's when Angela's sister Stacy suggested that law enforcement use a regular smaller boat to do another search. So on August 2nd, investigators searched this body of water, and it didn't take long for them to actually find something. Because shortly after the search began, a purple Ford F-150 was discovered. The truck was found turned upside down, and inside of the truck were Angela's remains. But sadly, after 8 months of being submerged in water, Angela's remains were essentially nothing more than just bones. There was no way of knowing how this truck made its way into the water, but police and investigators do believe that foul play was involved in Angela's death. They don't think this was an accident. And Angela was known to have been pretty familiar with the area where the truck and her remains were found. Now, after the autopsy was done, the manner of death was listed as undetermined. There was no cause of death that was listed either. And then it's super unclear as to where Angela's clothes and things like that were sent after her body was discovered. This case is a lot of wasn't me, and Angela's clothes were supposed to be sent to the Mississippi Crime Lab, but the crime lab doesn't have any documentation that those were ever sent to them. Angela's husband Daniel was able to be ruled out pretty quickly, so that's good. Crime Stoppers put up a $1,000 reward shortly after Angela was reported missing, and another $4,000 was added from the community and donations. But there's never been anything found to help this family get any closer to finding out what happened to Angela. It's been almost 20 years now, and we are absolutely no closer to answers. Angela's daughter Ginger, who was only 9 years old when her mom was reported missing, has now hired her own private investigator to look into her mom's death now that she's an adult and can do these things on her own. But it's almost like there was no kind of investigation into Angela's death. It's almost like where this truck was dumped, there were a few different, it was on a few different county lines or really close by, and they all just kind of hoped that the other one would do the investigation and take the lead. And it looks like the investigation just kind of never got done, period. And that's all I have for you this week. This ended up being a lot shorter than I was expecting to. But I've been working on the Darlie Roudier case. And I'm sure it'll be quite a few parts. So we should be able to start that one next week. Let's do it then. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.